rights of school-aged children. Well, with us now to look at the week ahead in federal politics is the Environment Minister Tony Burke and the Opposition Spokesman for Families, Housing and Human Services, Kevin Andrews. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Michael.
Tony Burke, if I could start with you, just what is the government trying to achieve with this flexible working arrangement plan?
I remember some years ago I worked for the union that looks after people in retail, and we got in some of the agreements clauses just like this one. They make a massive difference. Effectively what you often find is, even with a company that might be generally a good employer, you'll get a middle manager who, when someone comes back after parental leave and says, I want to come back only part-time, they get told, no, legally all we have to give you is your old job back. The right to request opens a whole lot of doorways. And I saw family after family be able to get real flexibility that made a difference to them being able to come to work as a result of these sorts of clauses. So I think what's being proposed here, you know, people talk about flexibility. Flexibility is not about cutting wages and cutting penalty rates. Flexibility is about making sure work can fit with people's family arrangements. It's exactly what this sort of clause does.
Kevin Andrews, does the opposition support the government's move?
Well, as Tony said, these are provisions which are already in the industrial arrangements, and this, as I understand it, is a proposed extension of them. If this means more flexibility, which we require in the workplace, well then obviously it's a good idea. If it means more burdensome regulation, well then we'll have to look at it. But we will look at the detail of it, and when we've seen the detail, we'll obviously come to a decision.
Well, the Greens, Tony Burke, aren't too happy. Adam Bandt, the Lower House Greens MP, says he's basically trashed what you're on about. He says the Greens won't be part of using families as a re-election stunt. He claims this is all about politics.
I think the Greens' argument goes to whether or not a right to request is enough. And having been there on the shop floor, seeing clauses like this, I mean, they're not there for every company at the moment, and the idea is to make it universal. But having seen on the ground these sorts of clauses make a massive difference to whether or not people can actually return to work. I think when you see those sorts of differences on the ground, it's a pretty tough call for someone to argue that that's not a real improvement for people.
Kevin Andrews, do you expect industrial relations, workplace relations to be a key election issue this year, and do you fear the coalition may feel compromised by the fact that a lot of voters still have very bad memories of work choices?
Well, work choices is a number of elections ago now, Michael. We've moved on from there. As Tony Abbott has said on many occasions, work choices is dead and buried and cremated, if that's not a sort of a mixed message. But the reality is work choices is gone. We will come forward with a sensible industrial relations policy. We've listened to the Australian people. They made it clear to us that they didn't appreciate some aspects of what work choices is on about, and so that's something of the past.
Tony Burke, if I could move to the mining tax. We had... Yeah, no, our time is short. We have a lot of issues to get through. The mining tax, $126 million raised in the first 6 months, way short of the $2 billion forecast over the entire year. Surely this blows your budget to smithereens.
The mining tax, by definition, is always going to be volatile. You look at the period from when it was legislated through to the end of last year, you had iron ore prices, for example, fall from $170 a tonne down to $80 a tonne. Now, some of those prices are kicking back up now. It will always be a volatile tax. But that was the idea, was to make sure that when the super profits kick in, that's when the revenue from that tax will kick in. And certainly, I think anyone who wants to project that where iron ore prices were and coal prices were in the last 6 months reflects where they'll be in the next 6 months is making a reasonably bold market projection.
But in the short term, where does that leave the various spending measures tied very firmly to the mining tax, particularly those relating to superannuation concessions?
Look, we have a record now of every time the budget comes out, every time my EFO comes out, the various budget documents, of making sure that to the extent that responsible cuts need to be made, we're making those in a responsible way and making sure that we're toning that down. We have, in the context of these falls in revenue, though, made clear that it does mean it's much more difficult and unlikely that we would end up with a surplus budget. So I think the different issues that we need to cover off on that have been covered off by the Treasurer for some weeks now.
Kevin Andrews, we keep asking your front bench colleagues whenever they come on the program, but it's a very serious question. Lots of voters are asking the same question about the coalition's policies, the coalition's costings. I know the opposition wants to scrap the mining tax, but you're still committed, for instance, to the increase in the superannuation guarantee levy to 12% that is tied to the mining tax. How quickly can we expect to see the coalition's promises and costed promises in this election year?
Well, let's go back a step first, Michael. Try all the spin as he likes. The reality is that for the government, they've got the trifecta. A surplus was promised and won't be delivered. 500,000 jobs were promised and won't be delivered. And now the mining tax revenue is not going to be delivered. That means that the $12 to $15 billion worth of expenditure, which is tied to the mining tax, is now all going to come from borrowings. So we're going to have even more borrowings from this government. So far as our expenditure is concerned, the reality is that we've still got a budget to come in May, and we've still got to have the final document from the government as to the state of the finances in the election campaign itself. So to ask us to put forward detailed of our expenditure at this stage and how that's going to be costed is simply impossible. We don't have the information, and we've got a financial situation for this government which is simply unravelling each day. No wonder Mr Swan has been in hiding over the weekend.
Is that fair enough, Tony Burke?
No, what Kevin Andrews has just said is because for this government mining tax revenue has fluctuated at the moment, we're at the lower end of it, that therefore that creates a massive problem for us. Don't forget, for the opposition, their promise is that mining tax revenue will always be at zero. The only people they're guaranteeing a tax cut for are the big mining entrepreneurs. They're the only ones who've got the guarantee of a tax cut at the moment. So every problem that Kevin Andrews wants to describe there is worse for them, because for them, mining tax revenue is always zero.
The big mining tax entrepreneurs, as Tony described them, are not paying any tax under his scheme. The reality is, instead of raising billions of dollars, this has raised just $126 million, a fraction of what was promised, a fraction of what is being promised by way of expenditure. The reality is that, once again, Mr Swan's finances are totally unravelling in front of the eyes of the Australian people.
OK, now, Kevin Andrews, you're doing what a lot of oppositions have done in the past. You're playing it careful, you're playing it safe ahead of the election. I want to ask you about the fact that Tony Abbott has scrapped his weekly appearance on a certain other breakfast program, and he hasn't done a decent TV interview since his encounter with Lee Sales on 7:30 about 6 months ago. Why is Tony Abbott avoiding scrutiny?
I don't think Tony Abbott's avoiding scrutiny at all. Tony, as I recall, has been doing a press conference every day. The media can ask him questions at those conferences, which he does every morning. He's somewhere around Australia, almost in a different location each day, getting around this country and listening to the concerns of the Australian people. So I don't think Tony is anything other than open to questions from the media.
But I mean, those doorstops, often they're wound up after 3 or 4 questions. I know, having stood through so many of them, they're rather different than a in detail 10 minutes go through all the issues TV interview.
Well, if you do them day after day, Michael, it's amazing how many questions get asked. And Tony, in my observation, is out there answering questions, listening to the Australian people, but answering questions of them and from the media every day.
Tony Burke, I wanted to ask you, we had Julie Bishop over the weekend saying that if the coalition was elected, Kevin Rudd could be in the frame for a diplomatic appointment. What are your thoughts about that?
Right now, I'm not in the frame of trying to work out what happens after the election, other than to make sure that we spend every day showing exactly why, after the election, we should be in government and what the dangers are of our opposition. I mean, the conversation you just had with Kevin, let's face it, every time Tony Abbott has subjected himself to scrutiny, it's gone pretty badly. That Lee Sales interview was not the highlight of Tony Abbott's career. A policy being released last week saying if you've got problems in the city, don't worry, the coalition will tell you to move. That's their way of fixing that. Every time they let you know what they might believe or they subject themselves to scrutiny, it doesn't end terribly well. So while, you know, this will be the first time in a while we've had an opposition that's objective in an election year is actually to hide their opposition leader. They want lots of photos of him, lots of pictures, but please don't ask him what he believes, because he might answer the question.
Well, what we've got on the other side, Michael, is a continuing leadership soap opera between Kevin Rudd, who's mischievously turning up everywhere and saying, oh, don't look at me, but in fact saying, you know, look at me, undermining Ms Gillard all the time.
And on that front, we'll leave it there. Kevin Andrews, Tony Abbott may not be appearing, but we do appreciate your time. And Tony Burke, sunrises, losses, our gain. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Michael.
Good to be with you.